When it comes to the music used by early Christians, a lot of it was Old Testament psalms. Appears to have been monophonic, continuing on, chanting, responsive singing, those kind of things would have continued. Sometimes baptism, of course, would have been an important part of the ceremony. Not every service probably would have included a baptism, but when it came to baptism and worship, there essentially develops these two parts of the service. There is a service that is a focus on the Word, right, the teaching, the reading of the memoirs of the apostles, preaching, etc., and then there is the observance of the Lord's Supper. Only those that had been baptized were allowed to stay for communion. Right? And so after that, once that first part was done, then those that weren't baptized were excused. Infant baptism, of course, seems to have been something that was gradually added, not something that was originally part of the practice of Christians. By the 3rd century, it's becoming more common. But even then, in the 2nd and 3rd century, people are preaching against baptizing their infants. So people were doing it, and they're saying, no, don't do that. Others, by the 3rd century, are saying, oh, this practice goes back to the apostles. But, there's no clear example of this. Eventually, people will talk about, well, Adam's sin stains all humanity, a doctrine that becomes known as original sin. And so infants have to be baptized to remove that stain, is the teaching that gets developed. Other things developing in the post-apostolic period, a Christian calendar. Right? First day of week, of course, would have been very important every week, but many Christians started to engage in fasting on Wednesdays and Fridays. We talked about the special Sunday of Easter and the controversy over when that should be observed. But then also, as more and more people died for their faith in the 2nd and 3rd century, Christians, especially those in the local regions where they took place, would remember the death dates of these martyrs, people that had given their lives for Christ. And so the calendar starts to fill up of these observances of, of course, the first day of the week, fasting, but then also these dates that become special because that's when somebody passed from this life into the next one because of their commitment to Christ. Eventually, as well, as part of connected to worship, throughout the 3rd century, you begin to see more Christian art. A lot of it done in places, they're not cemeteries per se, but the catacombs, places where bodies were interred after death. Burial was, of course, preferable to cremation. There's lots of art in the catacombs. A lot of it very simplistic, probably not what we would necessarily call good art, but you see the beginnings of art taking place. A lot of the art of early Christianity was biblical scenes, frequent ones, of course, related to Jesus. Jesus is the good shepherd, right? So carrying a sheep on his shoulders. Noah and the ark was also a popular one. Jonah, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You also see the development of Christian symbols in this artwork. The key rho symbol, which it would have been the first 2 letters of the name Christ in Greek, so the key and the rho. The fish, coming from the word fish in Greek was ichthus, and so Christians kind of made that into an acronym where each of the letters of ichthus stood for other things, specifically the phrase, Jesus Christ, God's Son, Savior. And so the beginnings of each of those words followed the word ichthus, and so the fish becomes a symbol of Christianity very early on. Others would include the dove, often connected with the Holy Spirit, the Alpha and the Omega, letters from the Greek, the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet, coming from the book of Revelation, where both God and Jesus say, I am the Alpha and the Omega. An anchor, coming from the book of Hebrews, we have this anchor of the soul. Even the phoenix, right, the mythical bird that burst into flames and then was reborn, so symbolizing resurrection. Also in the post-apostolic period, so that's Christian art, you also begin to see the development of church buildings. Very, very few at the time, at least those that have been discovered, that we can definitely say, well, this appears to have been a church building. Not too much before the middle of the 3rd century, but one of the earliest ones is one known as Dura Europos, which was discovered in Syria. It was excavated in 1922. It was a house that had been converted to a church building that could hold about 50 to 75 people. So the church buildings of those early times, the houses of those early times, were very limited in the sizes, the numbers of people that could be a part of it. But you do see the development then of these specific places that were used for the gathering of the church. Prior to this, most likely in homes, maybe rented buildings or public spaces, but eventually you start to see these church buildings developing that are being used. And of course, once Christianity becomes an accepted religion in the Roman Empire, then more and more you see the development of this. Prior to this, of course, meeting at homes would have been very useful for protection. Christians protecting themselves. As more and more wealthy Christians or wealthy people became Christians, their homes would have been bigger, would have been able to provide for, creating church buildings. As we get into the Middle Ages, of course, now we're moving into a situation where Christians are no longer the marginalized group, but they are the group in power. And with that, of course, there are a variety of changes that take place. Now, certainly the Middle Ages, very long period, so there's a lot of things that take place during that period, so I'm only going to highlight some things. One of the things I want to highlight takes place very early on in the Middle Ages. And essentially, this has to do with an overall question of worship, of practice. And basically, the question is, are the practices done by Christians sufficient in themselves, or is the worthiness of the person who is performing the practice important as well? Now, what do I mean by that? Essentially, we're getting to a position where, the important individuals in Christianity are responsible for performing worship. So it might be an elder or a bishop that is performing this worship ceremony, right? Blessing, saying the prayers, blessing the elements of the Eucharist, and then handing them out to everyone else. So, is that person's worthiness important? Or is there, does it matter if they're a sinner or not, right? They have unconfessed sin in their lives. Now, probably most of us today because of the way this turns out. Most of us would say, well, no, it's in the practice itself. It doesn't matter what that particular individual presiding, if their faith is terrible, that's on them. It's more about, am I participating in the appropriate way? Where's my heart? Where's my mind as as I'm being baptized, or as I'm singing, or as I'm taking the Lord's Supper? But essentially, this becomes a question related to the persecution of Christians. So in the 3rd century and the early 4th century, there were a couple of times where persecution was particularly severe. And even among Christian leaders, among Christian bishops, there were those who had either renounced Christ or turned away from Christianity. They fell to the persecution. They didn't die, because a lot of the persecution, especially in the 3rd century, was more about getting people to give up Christianity than it was about trying to kill people. So, what do you do about somebody who, let's say a church bishop is one of those, as there were, it was one of those who fell away, turned over scriptures, burnt religious books, whatever, in order to demonstrate they were no longer Christian. What about all of the people that they ordained to be religious leaders? Is their ordination still valid now that that person has fallen away? Well, again, we might say today, well, it doesn't matter about that. What matters is, is this person a worthy person? Does he meet certain qualifications, etc.? But at the time, it was a genuine question, and there was a division that takes place among Christians over this. Essentially, it comes down to it, and it was decided that, it is the basis of the work itself, right, what is being done, and not necessarily the worthiness of the one who is doing it, right? And so, the person that is ordaining someone, the person that is passing out the elements of communion, I mean, yes, it matters for that person, but it doesn't matter in the practice, right? It's the practice itself, and that's the important part. Is it being done in a proper way? Is the person receiving ordination worthy? Is the person who is receiving communion, is that person worthy? Those are the things that are ultimately more important. Also in the Middle Ages, you see a transition in church building style, these houses of worship. Most of the church buildings appear to have been destroyed during the persecution of Diocletian in the early 4th century, again suggesting why we don't have too many, although we have some like Dura Europus. So most Christians throughout the early part of the 4th century had returned to house churches. But when Constantine becomes emperor, and we'll talk more about that in a later video, when he becomes emperor, people flock to the church because Constantine is approving of Christianity, has aligned himself with Christianity. So you have this influx of people wanting to stay in the good graces of the emperor, as well as Christians being able to speak more freely about Christianity. And so new spaces were needed to contain these people flocking to Christianity. So in imperial centers, right, very important places in the empire, these church buildings often became very, very grandiose, very luxurious. The wealth was present. In some cases, Constantine would give previously governmental buildings to churches. Sometimes there were, and throughout the early Middle Ages, pagan temples were kind of taken over and turned into church buildings, sometimes with very little modification. So there's this luxury. So some of those buildings, were common public buildings in Rome that were then co-opted as churches. Very simple rectangular room with some columns in it. And one end would have been the area where the bishop would have sat, or the preaching would have been done, the Lord's Supper would have been taking place, etc. Eventually, other buildings would have been developed, some of them specifically constructed to face east, so and people offering prayer facing that direction. Usually also a communion table would have been toward the front, but what you begin to see in the Middle Ages is the transformation of talking about the Eucharist as a table meal, as Jesus had ordained it, and more about a sacrifice. And so the sacrificial aspects of Jesus' death become emphasized in the partaking of the Eucharist. And so the table that is used starts to become referred to as an altar instead of a table. A lot of them started as wood, but throughout the Middle Ages they become stone. That they were made out of stone. And so, there's this emphasis on the focus of Eucharist, sometimes referred to as the Mass, being an issue of sacrifice. Also developing during that time in the Middle Ages, the first part of the Middle Ages especially, we're talking about the 7th, 8th century, some into the 9th century, was this question of what did Jesus mean when he said, "This is my body"? Now, Christians, of course, by this point have been celebrating communion for centuries. And there's not much discussion about how the bread is Jesus' body, how the cup is his blood. You don't see that significant type of discussion. But with this transition of Eucharist, the Mass, being a sacrifice, you begin to see some speculation about the question of the real presence. So this man named Radbertus writes a tract, a little treatise, called On the Body and the Blood of the Lord in the year 834. And essentially he says that the prayers offered in communion, the Eucharist, transform the elements, the bread and the wine, into the actual body and blood of Christ. Now, it's something you can't experience through the senses. You don't suddenly see the bread turning into body. You don't see the wine suddenly turning into blood. But Radbertus claimed that we actually feast on the body and blood of Christ. And so there's this group of people become known as realists who, believe that there's this transformation. Others say, no. The elements are still physically bread and wine, but yes, Jesus is spiritually present, right? Passages like, where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, there I am in the midst of them. Other people, try to take a middle of the road. So, there's a great division that starts taking place over, what is this that takes place? And eventually, in the latter part of the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, very important theologian who we mentioned with scholasticism, is the one that kind of really lays out this view that is accepted by Catholics today, that the bread and the wine transform into the body and blood. It still looks like bread, it still tastes like bread, it still smells like bread, same thing with the wine, but they have actually, in the substance of those two elements, they've actually become the body and blood of Christ. And so this transformation, says Aquinas, is only understood through the eyes of faith. Right? Your physical eyes, you can't make any determination. Right? But in the eyes of faith, this transformation has taken place. And so throughout the latter part of the Middle Ages, you'll see these stories, and even into more modern times, of people actually, of people claiming they have actually seen the bread bleed, or other things like this, right? To talk about this kind of mystical thing that is taking place in the presence of the or in the practice of the Eucharist.